Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff St. John, and I'm Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media, a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to bringing our audience incisive and timely information and insight on the climate crisis and the clean energy transition. We welcome your financial support to keep doing our work, and we thank you for attending today's event. We're here to talk about clean hydrogen, to define what it is, why we need it, and what it can and can't do to advance the energy transition. Canary Media is publishing a special series this week delving into these complex questions. We welcome your input and questions as well. Please use the Q&A feature for those. And to set the stage, we're thrilled to talk with two individuals I consider some of the world's preeminent experts in the field. Michael Liebreich is an acknowledged speaker and thought leader on clean energy, mobility, technology, climate sustainability, and finance. He is co-managing partner of EcoPragma Capital and chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates. Michael is an honorary fellow of the Energy Institute. Michael Liebreich's former roles include member of the UK Board of Trade, advisor to the UN on Sustainable Energy for All, and a long-standing member of the Board of Transport for London. And Michael is also the founder of and a senior contributor to BloombergNEF. Thanks for being with us today, Michael.
Jeff, it's a huge pleasure. Huge pleasure.
Absolutely. The feeling is mutual. And then we have Jesse Jenkins. Jesse is a professor and expert in macro-scale energy systems engineering and climate policy at Princeton University, where he leads the Zero Lab. He was a principal investigator and lead author of the Princeton's landmark Net Zero America study and leads the REPEAT project, which provides regular independent environmental and economic evaluation of federal energy and climate policies. And Jesse and his colleagues also published the first peer-reviewed research on the full emissions impact of grid-connected hydrogen production under different clean electricity procurement rules, which has shaped debate over clean hydrogen rules in the EU and United States. Thanks very much, Jesse, for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here.
Likewise. All right. So the title of this talk is The Future of Clean Hydrogen, Separating Hope from Hype. What do we mean by that? Well, in simple terms, the hope for clean hydrogen is that it can solve our long-term decarbonization challenges that can't be solved with clean electricity alone, and that it can be used first and foremost to clean up the dirty hydrogen industry that exists today. But then there's the hype around clean hydrogen. And first, there's the concern that government and industry expectations for ramping up clean hydrogen supply aren't quite realistic. But there's also the concern that hydrogen could be produced in ways that are not, in fact, clean and potentially used for decarbonization purposes for which it's not a well-suited or potentially even counterproductive. So that's our take, and that's the thesis we're exploring in this week's special series. But let me ask you two, what do you think? How do you distinguish hope from hype in clean hydrogen? And Jesse, if you don't mind, let me start with you first.
Yeah, I think that the hope for hydrogen and its critical role is that, like electricity, it's a carbon-free energy carrier or fuel that we can use to move energy around our economy, to store it, and to use it. So, there's no carbon atoms in the hydrogen molecule, right? It's just H2. And so when you combust it or use it as a reductant in a chemical process or use it in a fuel cell, it can produce electricity or energy or perform that chemical role without emitting any direct carbon dioxide emissions. And so in that sense, it's very similar to electricity or steam, our other main carbon-free energy carriers that have to play a much more central role in a decarbonized economy. Now, the challenge is that you have to produce hydrogen. It isn't just lying around. We could come back later and talk about the potential for natural hydrogen, which actually may be formed via geologic processes underground. But generally, this is not like a fossil fuel that you mine. It's something you have to produce, and it takes a lot of energy to produce hydrogen, typically from water, H2O, or from methane, natural gas, which is CH4. So split the hydrogen out, and you end up with the CO2. That's how we make most of the hydrogen today, and that CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. And so if we continue to do it that way, it's a polluting fossil fuel effectively, because we're deriving hydrogen from natural gas and we're emitting the CO2. If we want to make it a clean fuel, we have to produce it in a clean way. Just like with electricity from coal, it may be clean when you use it, but the overall emissions footprint is significant. So it's a lot of similar issues as we face around, transitioning to cleaner electricity sources. We need clean methods to produce hydrogen, and they really truly need to be clean. And we have to pay attention to the energy efficiency of that process. If there's a more efficient, direct way to use clean electricity, for example, that should be preferred to using hydrogen because it helps us do more with less energy.
Great. Thank you. And Michael, you've been covering this subject kind of consistently and extensively. How do you define the hope for clean hydrogen, and where would you categorize the hype uh, confusing things a bit? Michael, you are muted.
I apologize there. I just had to step out and get the kids off the broadband, because otherwise we were going nowhere. So I muted, but I'm back. So Jeff, the question of hype versus the sort of the reality, my starting point is that we currently use hydrogen in the economy. We use about 100 million tons per year. And as Jesse points out, most of it, the vast majority, is made from fossil fuels. And so, if we're looking at cleaning up the economy, getting to net zero, job number one is to sort that out. And so, I'm enormously excited about the possibilities for doing that, because we do have good possibilities. I'm not a zealot for green hydrogen. I'm actually okay if blue hydrogen is done right. And we might come back to what that means in terms of capturing the fugitive methanes upstream. We can't have leaks of natural gas. We've got to capture the CO2, all of it, not just some of it, and so on.
Right.
But obviously the most exciting is green. It's hydrogen from renewable electricity, pink hydrogen, hydrogen from nuclear. You've got turquoise, you've got white hydrogen. Jesse already mentioned geological hydrogen. So we can clean up this 100 million tons of hydrogen, which is used in fertilizers, used in refineries, and causes about 2.5% of global emissions. So that's real, and it's a real challenge. Where I think we are going wrong is when we start to postulate that just because hydrogen can do transport, hydrogen can be used for heating, the hydrogen can be used for overnight storage or for grid balancing, all sorts of things. But because it can, it therefore will. And the problem with hydrogen, Jesse, you talked about the fact that we got to get the production costs down. Well, yeah, but you've got to produce the hydrogen. You've probably got to move it from some desert or some offshore, wind field or wherever it's being produced. You've got to move it to somewhere useful. You probably got to store it, buffer it, compress it. By the way, if you've put it in a pipeline and then you want to put it in a fuel cell, you probably have to clean it and purify it again. You then have to get it into whatever machinery, whether it's a car, whether it's a refinery. You're going to have to move it around. And all of these things are expensive. And they're expensive in a way which doesn't yield to the sorts of cost reduction that we've seen in, solar, to a certain extent, wind and batteries. Turbo compressors are not going to be 10 times cheaper than they are today in 7 years or 10 years, or even frankly in 30 years. And so you've got these really substantial economic issues and a whole bunch of other associated safety, nitrous oxides, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what we got to do is focus on that 100 million tons and a few other use cases where hydrogen is so valuable. It does something that's so difficult to do using direct electrification that Jesse talked about, that you're going to do it there as well. But it's a limited number of use cases, which I put into this kind of ladder. A lot of people might have seen the hydrogen ladder, the ones that we're going to do at the top, and the ones I call it the row of doom, stuff we're not going to do down at the bottom. That's where the hype is, that scooters and taxis and buses and trains and home heating, space heating, all of these things. Like, no. This is just a complete non-starter use cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we'll definitely get into the demand side and how we structure demand signals, demand policies, and support for the industries to get it to where it ought to go. I wanted to jump back first, though, and probably could have presaged this conversation by noting that we've primarily focused on U.S. clean hydrogen policy in our series. And of course, a lot of the focus, I think, of the media and of lobbying and industry has been on the supply side. And Jesse, I know that you mentioned your work on what has become known as the 3 pillars approach for managing or measuring the emissions impact of clean hydrogen. And with the groundbreaking 45V tax credit created by the Inflation Reduction Act being the main driver of hydrogen supply side policy support, we've now got, at least in proposed guidance, a pretty strong commitment to the three pillars approach: additionality, deliverability, and hourly matching of electricity going in. Can you tell us about why that's important and what it means for the near-term evolution of U.S. green hydrogen production?
Yeah, so the basic issue is that you can use electricity through this electrolysis process to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. That consumes quite a bit of electricity. And if that electricity isn't very clean, it actually can produce more emissions than simply using hydrogen from natural gas. So if you plug an electrolyzer in to the average grid, emissions intensity in the United States today, it produces nearly twice as much greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of hydrogen that you produce as it does to produce it from natural gas. So we can't just use electricity. We have to use very clean electricity if we want the hydrogen that we produce to actually have very low emissions impact or near zero emissions impact. So that's sort of the background. And then the legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, created a new tax credit that has gradated tiers of increasing incentives as the life cycle emissions or the emissions associated with the production of hydrogen declines. And that highest tier is $3 per kilogram. And that's really designed to support the early cost of electrolyzer deployment, which is then expected to fall as the cost of producing electrolyzers and building large scale projects declines. So it's meant to kickstart this green hydrogen industry. But the statute is clear that we don't want to just build electrolyzers, period. We want to make sure that those electrolyzers are fueled by very clean electricity. And so the statutory requirement is that emissions from hydrogen production have to be about 95% cleaner than fossil hydrogen production today. So hydrogen production from natural gas. So 0.45 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. And just to put a fine point on how clean the electricity mix has to be to hit that target, if less than 1% of your electricity supply comes from coal-fired power plants, or about 2% from average natural gas plants, that's enough to breach that threshold. So Congress has set a really high bar, I should say low bar, for emissions, right? It has to be very low in order to qualify for that $3 a kilogram subsidy. And so then the question is, how do you actually demonstrate that if you're plugged into the grid, you're not using the average grid mix, you're using specific clean electricity? And the traditional approach to that has been to use these renewable energy certificates or credits, which are generated for every megawatt hour of clean electricity that's produced. And because you can't track electrons on the grid from point A to point B, they all just sort of mingle about in the grid. You instead use these certificates as a proof of who bought what. So it's sort of what they call a book and claim system or an accounting scheme to show that only one person can claim that megawatt hour and it was sold from this producer to this buyer. So the idea is, if you have one of these, you can staple it onto your megawatt hour of electricity and you can demonstrate that you bought clean electricity. The problem is the conventional approach to that hasn't paid any attention to when and where you actually consume that electricity or produce it. So you can buy a renewable energy certificate from anywhere in the country, produced at any time. And that has traditionally been used to sort of try to cancel out the emissions impact of your electricity use. And there's been a growing recognition in the sort of voluntary clean energy markets, in the corporate procurement space, that is an inadequate approach that doesn't truly zero out your emissions, because there's a mismatch between the emissions impact of, say, a solar system that's producing during the middle of the day and the emissions impact of a data center or an electrolyzer or a household that's consuming at some other profile somewhere else in time.
Right.
And so the principles of the three pillars is that if you want to demonstrate that you're consuming clean electricity, you have to show that someone is producing clean electricity that you bought, and they're producing it at the same time that you're consuming and in a location that could be delivered to where you are on the grid. And it shouldn't be an existing resource that was already producing clean electricity that you just diverted to your use, because that's just moving things around on paper. You actually have to be adding new clean electricity to the grid if you're going to be adding new demand and canceling it out. And if you do that, if you meet those requirements, it's basically the same emissions impact as plugging physically in to a wind or solar or nuclear generator that you've added to the grid.
Right.
So that's the effective approach. Basically, every hour you're adding demand and canceling it out with clean electricity that's produced in the same region from a new resource at the same time you're using it. And so that principle we demonstrated in our research and a paper led by Wilson Ricks, who's a PhD candidate in my group, that approach is very effective at producing very low system level impacts across the whole grid. And that the conventional strategy, that really, if you ignore any one of those three pillars, it's enough to bring down the whole house. That's why we call them pillars. They're really all structural. And so if you avoid any of those, if you use existing resources instead of new resources, if you're buying power from the other side of the country, from where you are, or if you're buying power that's produced at a different time than you're consuming, any one of those is enough to drive emissions impacts way above the threshold that Congress has set. And so the rules in Europe and in the United States are now centered around those three principles. There are technical details to exactly how it's implemented, but that's the basic idea is, you have to cancel out your consumption with new clean electricity that's produced at the same time you're using it in a location near where you're consuming it.
Gotcha. And I guess I should ask you, Michael, what you make of the three pillars or its co-equal kind of policy for, I think, renewable hydrogen in the EU, and just get a sense of the balancing act that policymakers have had to undertake in order to establish clear rules that tie significant subsidies to clean hydrogen production to ensure that it's truly clean, as opposed to setting restrictions on the approach of clean hydrogen producers in ways that might make it more difficult for them to actually produce hydrogen cost effectively.
So before I answer those questions, I want to share something. People may know I spend quite a bit of time on Twitter. What I'm mainly doing, or X as it's now called, what I'm mainly doing is reading the news, right? But there's this fantastic thing which was posted by Nathan Ayer, who's a senior associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who explained these three pillars just brilliantly.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this, Michael. I love it. Yeah.
So this is called, there's incrementality, deliverability, and time matching. So incrementality is called bring your own beer. So there's a party, you bring your own beer, that's additional, it's incremental. The second thing is deliverability. You actually have to bring your beer to the party. You can't just buy an extra beer and drink it at home. And the third thing, which is time matching, you bring your own beer to the party at the actual time that the party is happening. So I love it because it's so simple. Now, the problem that I do have a bit of a problem, I have a big problem with this whole idea that you can sort of legislate to ensure that whatever you do with hydrogen is kind of better than not doing it. Mm-hmm. Because the fundamental problem is, if you're starting with green electricity, the fundamental question is, why wouldn't you just use the green electricity? Now, of course, if you postulate a world where there's no limitations to green electricity, there's no supply chain constraints in wind and solar, there's no limits to land, there's no limits to money, there's no limits to the talent to build either the generators or the connections to the grid, well, okay, that's a different world. That's not the world that we live in. The world we live in is heavily constrained. So now I think you have to ask the question, if it's constrained, every time you make a kilowatt hour, megawatt hour, gigawatt hour of green electricity, what should you do with it? And, we're in the climate crisis, right? Everybody believes that. So what you should do with that green electricity is fundamentally whatever gets rid of the most carbon or the most carbon dioxide, right? And then you start asking, I don't have any PhD students I can throw at things. I have to actually, sort of kind of do it myself with my very small team. Jeff, if you're listening, thank you for helping. So what I did was I said, not Jeff, Jeff is my analyst, Jeff Liu, brilliant analyst. And what we did was we said, okay, if you had, and we did it for the UK, I've done it for Japan as well, you could do it for the US. If you have 1 terawatt hour of green electricity, frankly, or pink electricity, nuclear power would be the same. If you've got 1 terawatt hour, what do you do with it to help the climate most? Right. So if that's the homework question, and then the answer is push coal off the grid. Push coal off the grid. You don't do anything else. Just put it on the grid if you can use it to remove coal. The second thing you do with it is you use it to power heat pumps, because heat pumps multiply the value of what you're doing by the coefficient of performance 3, 4, 5 times. So it's enormously effective, because if you're heating your homes, your space heating is powered by gas, you're now pushing 3, 4, 5 times as much gas off the grid as if you simply replace gas on the grid. So you've got rid of the coal, then you've done heat pumps. The number 3 thing you do is actually charge an electric car or an electric vehicle. Why? Because internal combustion vehicles are so damn inefficient that you're pushing a lot of petrol or diesel off the system by using an electric car. Just switching to an electric car is, good for the climate, right? And I know the embodied carbon and we know the calculations, and it's not perfect, but it's better. The 4th thing you do after getting coal off the grid, doing heat pumps and doing EVs, the 4th thing, when you finish doing all of that, is actually steel, hydrogen steel. And the reason it's hydrogen steel, not ammonia or any other use of hydrogen, is because when you make steel with hydrogen, you're pushing coking coal, right? There's a hint in the name. It's coal. It's really bad. And you're pushing that out of the system. So the 4th thing you do is steel. And when you're done with that, you can start with things like ammonia, and you can start with things like hydrocracking. So in other words, replacing the dirty hydrogen that we currently use.
Right.
So that's a long way of saying all of this stuff about additionality is it's called additionality more in your, all of those things. It's all nonsense, because we are constrained in the amount of green electricity we can produce. And in that constrained world, none of the things you can meet the 3 pillars, but actually what you're doing is starving the grid of green electricity to do the things that I mentioned, with the single exception of truly stranded assets. If there's a renewable resource that you could exploit, but you simply can't get the electricity into the grid, then there's an argument for it, because frankly, you can get more solar panels, you can get more wind turbines. Those are not the parts of the supply chain that are constrained. So for stranded renewables assets, you can go ahead and you can do your 3 pillars and do it. But as soon as you're connected to the grid, use the green electricity or the pink electricity from nuclear elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. That all makes sense. And I appreciate your Maslow's hierarchy of needs for what to do to decarbonize. I guess the tricky thing is that clean hydrogen policy isn't just about meeting those near-term imperatives. And this is, I think, the place where things get especially confusing. I know that the Electric Power Research Institute did a study of 45V tax credits in which it found that the carbon abatement cost of clean hydrogen was an order of magnitude greater than the carbon abatement cost of those alternatives you mentioned. But it went on to say that there are other values to prompting or priming clean hydrogen production that are longer term in nature. And I'm just trying to figure out how we balance the need for long-term commitments to a long-term supply of clean hydrogen for the things we really need it for against those short-term imperatives. And
yeah,
I don't know.
This is a classic, technology policy challenge, right? Which is like, we don't want actually any real clean hydrogen today, because we're still doing the first 3 things on Michael's list pretty much everywhere in the world, right? But we're going to need it to do steel and ammonia and other things, 10 years from now or 15 years from now, once we've hopefully finished much of that first 3 items on the to-do list. But it's not going to be ready for prime time at a cost that's affordable with, industry practices that are understood and, all of that, unless we get started today. And so that's really the kind of objective of policy in the near term, is trying to get these markets moving. I think one of the challenges with the US approach is that we simply have a supply side push. All we have is a subsidy to produce hydrogen. And it is a very, very lucrative subsidy. So, $3 a kilogram makes it you willing to consume electricity until it costs $80 or $90 a megawatt hour, which means without the right rules to govern them to make sure that you're only consuming clean electricity, you'll be perfectly happy to buy fairly expensive natural gas fired or even cheaper coal fired power and just continually produce hydrogen and claim that subsidy. And so
Right.
it's the fact that it's a production subsidy that's worth so much that makes it quite distortive, right, in terms of the order of operations and what we're doing here, unless you attach the right procurement rules on the electricity purchases, and that's where the three pillars come in. But even then, there's nothing to make sure that that hydrogen is used in the highest and best use cases, like steel, which is actually, again, we agree. We were actually finishing a paper, a very similar paper, Michael, as you're describing, and sort of figure out the order of operations here. Steel is the top of the list in terms of emissions potential, but it's one of the most expensive to do, to convert over. So it has the sort of lowest market willingness to pay today to get green hydrogen. And so that's not going to work unless we bridge that gap with demand side policy or incentives for steel producers to make the capital expenditures and switch over the design of their plants and practices to buy clean hydrogen. Just, dumping subsidized hydrogen on the market itself won't necessarily align with our emissions goals. And so I really appreciate this work to sort of think through the order of operations. That's what policymakers really need to be thinking about as well, and making sure that we have the incentives in place so that we're scaling up this industry now, but whatever clean hydrogen we're producing is also going towards those highest and best uses, and not say, the easiest things to do, which should just be dump it into natural gas networks and blend it at a 5% blend rate or something. You can absorb a lot of hydrogen that way, but it's a very low value use, and it doesn't help the demand side of the picture, build out the use cases that we really need in the long term either.
Mhm. So, what is the demand side policy prescription? And Michael, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. If there is one that we can point to and say, this is the way to do it, or perhaps parts and pieces of it. In the US, I believe the Clean Hydrogen Hubs program, with $7 billion committed, or at least provisionally approved, for 7 clean hydrogen hubs around the country, and an additional billion for as yet unspecified demand side incentives, seems to be the primary, if not sole, demand side structure. In the EU, I think things are significantly different, with existing policy, as well as policy and development, kind of promoting the active use of clean hydrogen and its purchase at the premiums at which we're talking about needing people to start to buy it to get production up and running. But where are we at with demand side stuff?
Right, so first of all, hubs is the answer, right? Hubs is the answer. And that goes back to the hydrogen ladder, where you look at those top use cases. You look at fertilizer, you look at petrochemicals industry, hydrocracking, and you look at the next row down, the things that are kind of very hard to do, very hard to envisage us succeeding in: long duration storage, or aviation fuels, or shipping fuels, without some kind of contribution of the hydrogen sector. They're all things that happen in industrial clusters, right? They do not happen in the community. They don't happen on the high street. They don't happen in the home. So we got to get the hydrogen is all going to be consumed around hubs. It is today, and it will be in the future. But I love the conversation so far, because the hydrogen ladder, in a sense, is a sort of inevitability scale. That's where it will be used eventually. Then we've talked about a different dimension, which is, where would you do it first, which is the priorities that I laid out. And then, what Jesse has brought in is, the last segment was about sort of path dependencies, maybe some industrial policy. You want to drive the costs down. You can't just sort of do all the easy stuff and then run into a brick wall. But there's also political economy and willingness to invest. Those refineries may not be the best use of hydrogen, but boy, that's a bunch of companies that know how to move hydrogen around, and they're under deep pressure by society to do something. So it may be easier to motivate them than to motivate a steel company, which is going to have to spend billions and billions and billions rebuilding all of its arc furnaces, all of its blast furnaces and so on, to use hydrogen. So all these different dimensions. But you talked about, how does policy on the demand side help? I want to take a bit of a step back, because, as Jesse pointed out, the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies or tax breaks are so generous that you're kind of assuming lots of hydrogen is going to happen. But let's look at the kind of unsubsidized economics. You've got polluting hydrogen, gray hydrogen, which costs somewhere between $1 and $2 around the world, depending on whether you've got very cheap gas, like in the US, or a place like Qatar. $2, maybe $2.50 in a place with more expensive gas, Europe, Asia, and so on.
Mhm.
And then you've got the production cost of hydrogen, which right now is green hydrogen is $4 to $5. Right? That's the reality. People thought it'd be $3 by now. We had inflation. They figured out that they need these compressors and it's hard and all that stuff. So it's $4 to $5. So you've got a gap that's around, let's be really generous and let's call it, $2 per kilo. It's $2 to $3 per kilo is a gap that needs to be filled. And as Jesse said, you give somebody $3 and they're in business, right? You give them the IRA credit, they're in business. But the problem is on the demand side, if you're just a hydrogen user, that's hydrogen is a commodity, that's fine. But if you are a trucking company, a steel company, a glass company, you're going to have to, first you have to move the hydrogen around, and then you have to get it into an industry that's not currently using it. Just closing that gap on the production side does not get your hydrogen into use, right? Because, if I'm a trucking company and I'm using diesel, I already could use $1.50 hydrogen, right? I could make it from natural gas. I don't do it. Why? Because it's a really, really crappy fuel. So you don't use it at $1.50. So if you're telling me, oh, well, now you can get $5 hydrogen with a $3 subsidy and it's only $2, and you're like, well, why would I?
Yeah.
So you need more subsidies on the demand side, and some of them are very, very substantial. Because it is so costly to move. Hydrogen in a tube trailer. You need 18 tube trailers to deliver enough hydrogen to a fueling station to replace one diesel tanker or one petrol tanker, right? This is really expensive stuff. So to get the hydrogen into use doesn't cost $3 a kilo. It might cost $5, $7, $10, $12, $15. We don't even know for some of these use cases how expensive it's going to be. Once you've transported it from where it's made, wholesale, then stored it, then distributed it, and then modified the equipment and managed safety and all those things.
Right.
So what happens though is that if you say, well, let's average it, let's make the maths easy. Let's say on average, let's say $3 is the right number, that with $3 you can get hydrogen into the market. The problem is that is $3 for every kilo of hydrogen. So when these countries that I see all over the place, they say, oh, we're going to have 1 million tons by this and 1 million tons by that per year.
10 million.
Right? 10 million. Europe, we want to have 10 million. We, the EU, UK is not part of it, but we have our own silly targets.
UK wants to do its own 10 million tons for a tiny country. It's like, where did that number come from?
We want to do 10 gigawatts rather than 10 million.
Okay.
I don't even know. But
the
EU wants to do 10 million tons of its own, and it wants to import 10 million tons by 2030.
Yeah.
By 2030, right? Let's do the maths. That's 20 million tons, 20 billion kilos, times, we're being really generous, $3. That's $60 billion
a year.
Per year, right? Now, the problem is, if you go to somebody and say, well, you make that hydrogen, if I give you $60 billion, will you make me those 20 million tons? They'll say no. Why? Because they need 10 years guaranteed offtake, probably 15, but we'll make the maths easy again. So you're going to do $60 billion a year for 10 years. And that's the money you have to put on the table today, right? If you don't put it on today, nobody's reaching final investment decision. Okay, so that's $600 billion. Now, the European method of applying subsidy to hydrogen is the hydrogen bank, where they're going to buy hydrogen expensively and sell it cheap, right? It's a great business model if you're funded by taxpayers. And it is funded to the tune of something, I think it's 3.8 billion euros, so $4.5 billion. So 600 billion needed, and that's a vast understatement, probably by a factor of 2 or 3, and 4 or 5 billion on the table. And that's where we're facing. That's where, when you wanted to separate the hype from the this, from the that is really the situation. That's in Europe. In the US, you've got the IRA subsidies, right? The IRA supports, and they are enough for production as long as you're going to use it in an industry that's used to using hydrogen. Right. But because of additionality and because there's a constrained upstream, you've actually got a different problem. You've got people out there that are going to get multiple IRA subsidies, right? Multiple, because the IRA, the way it's structured, is you can double dip and you can triple dip. And you have people running around saying, oh, we're going to make synthetic methane. This marvelous company, TES. We're going to make synthetic methane, right? We're going to get subsidies to do renewables from the IRA. We're going to get subsidies to use that to electrolyze for hydrogen. We're going to get subsidies to capture CO2. And then we're going to do the Sabatier process. Presumably there's more subsidies somewhere, who knows, in the Infrastructure Act or whatever. There's all sorts all over the place.
California's low carbon fuel standard.
And they're going to get more than $60 per million BTU of subsidies to produce a commodity that's worth $3. Henry Hub price for methane is $3. $60 of subsidy produces a commodity worth $3. And that, they're going to, if they can do that, if they're lawyers, the constrained resource here is lawyers. If they can do that, they will. And they will starve the other pieces of the value chain, the other pieces of the supply chain of oxygen, not literally oxygen, but all of the money is going to flow into these dumb business models. That's the risk in the US.
Right. And I'm sure we should talk at length in future webinars about how the US Treasury Department and ancillaries at DOE and EPA are structuring the various tax credit programs to forego such counterproductive
They're
outcomes.
not.
I would love to hear it, because they're not, because
They're
it
not.
explicitly says you can double and triple dip. And so the three pillars, the strictness of the three pillars, I interpret as an attempt to make it difficult to do those things. What actually happens is it makes difficult just the production of hydrogen to use in fertilizers, right? What it doesn't make, it means that the people who are double and triple dipping are the only ones who will be able to have it, it'll be profitable enough to navigate the system. That's your risk.
Interesting. So I guess then the question is, you can do that, but who's going to agree to buy it? And I am really interested in how you all are seeing the demand side of this equation setting its own rules by which it will differentiate between productive and counterproductive processes of the type that you're describing.
Jeff, just let me say, you don't need a buyer with those levels of subsidies. You could flare it. You could pretend to need to mine blockchain in the middle of the desert, and you're going to make money. And the less efficient your processes are, right, the more renewables you have to generate and the more hydrogen you need. So it's like this is potentially, we are barreling down the road to this bizarre sort of Solyndra type meltdown of policy.
So we're not based on our math. We did a paper on this as well, sort of the effect of IRA on the cost of synthetic fuels and hydrogen production for different methods. I don't think we're on that path yet. If electrolyzer costs decline by 50-60% over the next 7 years, which is what we probably should expect given the analog that we have readily available in batteries and solar PV, which are like electrolyzers, a mass-produced electrochemical device. And so I would expect that they will fall dramatically in cost over the next 5 to 10 years as we scale up these markets and start building gigawatt scale factories and gigawatt scale electrolyzers, which is what's coming down the pipe. The IRA subsidies available for projects that commence construction through the end of 2032. And so it's that end of the period that I am very concerned, and actually spend a lot of time talking to Senate Finance Committee staff about before the IRA passed, to explain that if you have a production subsidy, which is in dollars per unit of volume, for a technology that is designed to come down in cost over time, you should not use the same dollar value to get that industry started as you're going to pay them a decade from now when they've scaled up, because the cost is going to fall. So we should have, if they had heeded my recommendations, had that subsidy decline over time, or as a function of the volume that we deploy, or some other way to make it dynamic over time.
Okay.
And we didn't. We set the same $3 kilogram out to 2032. And so I do worry that by the end of that period, it will make sense simply to produce hydrogen and flare it and make a subsidy farm. And I think we'll probably have to come back and solve that problem in a few years.
Yeah, well, I know that 45D proposed guidance does say no flaring. Yeah, I
Okay,
think
I
that's-
mean, I'm being facetious. Fine,
Yeah.
run it through a combustion turbine and make some electricity and give it away. I mean, like,
Right.
it really doesn't matter what you do with it at that point.
The example I've used is just pretend to make, or mine block, do blockchain,
Yeah, exactly.
Bitcoin mining, because that's that's a legitimate use. At least it looks to a policymaker as a legitimate. It's not illegal, and that's what you want to do. So
Yeah,
you
and,
could.
the
And
best the best
there
case
is a
scenario.
case.
Go ahead.
So there's an interesting case study that I think maybe the audience, if they want to kind of think through how this might play out, which is actually Spanish solar subsidies back in 2008. Because what happened is Germany instituted the feed-in tariffs and saw this, enormous surge of capital flowed in, technology was being developed, jobs were being created. And Spain said, hey, look, that we want some of that. So they then they put in the same tariff as Germany. The problem being, of course, it's much sunnier in Spain. So suddenly you were looking, it was uncapped, unlimited, just like the IRA. You build it, you get the money. And of course, each solar panel that was kind of, almost like en route to Germany suddenly swerved because you'd go down to Spain and make twice as much revenue. So you did. And it didn't, the digression, as they call it, this reduction in the tariff, the reduction in the revenue over time was way insufficient. Yeah. And so in 1 year, Spain added enough kind of liability for these tariffs to add 10% to their national debt.
Right.
In 1 year.
And then the market crashed after a bunch of shenanigans and stuff.
Right. No, after Spain ended the subsidy because they were going to go bankrupt. So, it was a huge policy uncertainty then, right? It comes down crashing on the market.
But they didn't just end it. They ended it retroactively.
Yeah.
They said, you thought you were going to have earned this, but we're actually not going to honor that. They changed the number of hours of eligibility. They thought they'd done it very cleverly. It took 10 years to restore faith and trust in those markets.
Okay.
Michael, it's a shame that we don't disagree more. This is exactly the example I use to try to explain this to the Senate.
So let's say
what I'm concerned about too.
We got to figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen on the supply side. But let me turn back to the demand side, because we do have a lot of questions about the hydrogen hubs here in the US. And I am really interested in how you guys see the kind of salutary demand side incentive structures developing so that the hydrogen that is made goes to the places that actually need it. And what do you guys make of the hubs to date? How do you see the importance of hubs policy development? Which hubs where are better or less well suited? Tell me what you think about those.
So look, the hubs was, we had $8 billion in funding from the infrastructure law to support these hydrogen hubs, which is sort of a place-based policy to try to do two things, I think, two main goals. One was to try to connect all the dots here, right? You've got hydrogen producers of different types, you've got consumers of different types, you've got to transport it in between. There are big economies of scale to this, right? Michael mentioned how hard it is to put this on a truck, put hydrogen on a truck. It's much better if you can get enough demand that you can build a pipeline and put it in the pipeline like they have in the Gulf Coast region, where you have a lot of chemical companies and refineries that need hydrogen. So if you can build up economies of scale in one place, that could really help kickstart a hydrogen economy in that location. So that's the sort of first goal. And the second could be as a technology policy to say, look, we recognize that even with a $3 kilogram subsidy or whatever on the production side, there are going to be these additional costs to adopt the end use technologies, to switch to the equipment that can use the hydrogen, to build the infrastructure, to build the storage and the pipelines. And some of those first mover projects are going to be more expensive than the nth of a kind projects. So DOE can cover up to half of that cost, right, with that funding. So it could have both been an effort to align demand and drive technology policy and create these sort of place-based applications. Unfortunately, what I think happened instead was an effort to spread the money out as far as possible across as many locations as possible, while doing some of that, right? I don't want to, say that DOE wasn't thinking about those objectives too. It certainly was, but
and the law said they had to do this, that, and the other.
Well, they had to do, so they had to do at least one that had hydrogen, or that had nuclear, in it. They had to do at least one that had natural gas in it, or fossil in it. But that was it, really. And they had to do a couple in different locations. But they didn't have to do 7 in around basically every region in the country. and they didn't necessarily have to do it in the way that they did. And so it's become a bit of a challenge because it's basically created an expectation in every region in the country that they should be producing hydrogen in the near term. And that's not really the right order of operations. I mean, there are parts of this country that are better to produce hydrogen than others right now. And if you're going to try to use that limited pool of money to kind of kickstart these use cases, I wish that they would have been a bit more targeted in how they did that. The other challenge is that they didn't really premise the grants, the DOE grants for the hubs, on the idea that electrolytic hydrogen producers, as part of those hubs, would have to meet the 3 pillars requirements. It's a bit of a disagreement internally between the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations at DOE, which manages that program, and the Treasury folks that are thinking longer term. Again, different objectives, right? Thinking about how do we set up a subsidy that's going to govern this market for the next 15 years or so, who aligned on the need for the 3 pillars. So we have a bit of tension right now, and it's created, I think, a pretty big political question and challenge for the implementation of the hydrogen rules at Treasury that we're in the middle of still, finalizing. So, it's the goals. I think it could have been a useful tool to do demand side alignment. There is some of that that's happening because it is pulling in different use cases in these different hubs. But it feels a bit spread out to me to really accomplish those goals effectively. And unfortunately isn't premised on 3 pillars compliant electrolytic hydrogen in most places.
Okay. And Michael, I don't know if you have any thoughts or have any corresponding kind of examples from Europe that we ought to look at.
So I said that, it is about hubs. The hydrogen game is about hubs because that's where the inevitable, the top few rows of the ladder get done. Even if you take the kind of, we've got a climate crisis, what should we do first? And you're going to generate power and you're going to put that into the grid to push off coal. You still do that in a hub, right? That's still a big generator is what you're going to use you're going to feed it into the grid. You're going to do it from big wind or solar farm. But the other uses, even if you get down to steel, it's in a hub. So it's going to be about hubs. What should they look like? Multiple industries, because then you get the kind of correlations, temporal correlations, when one's down for maintenance or seasonally not making whatever, then others will kick in. So you probably want to have some kind of a ring main around a hub that's going to share and move hydrogen between multiple users. Mm-hmm. And the hubs probably want to be connected to each other. And they need to be connected to where the hydrogen's coming from, whether it's blue hydrogen, whether it's green or pink or whatever. It can either get there as electricity or it can get there as hydrogen. And you kind of want to have that infrastructure in place. I think that you can state all of that with quite a lot of certainty. And you can definitely state that we need to get the gray hydrogen out of the system. It's when you go beyond that and saying, okay, let's put money down and make sure that some steel company is making some steel and some, aviation fuel is being made and maybe some shipping fuel. And we're going to make sure that ammonia is being done, but not too much because we want to spread things that 8 billion cake, by the time it gets cut 7 ways and then it gets cut through different industries, is going to turn out to be, what we call in the UK, threepence halfpenny for every, per user, just a few cents per user. And that's not going to work. So I think equally, what's going to happen is that, I guess we could waste the 8 billion trying to do all this kind of cutting it too fine, or just build that architecture, the pipelines and the grid upgrades to make sure that the hydrogen flows to the hubs. Because right. You've got the IRAs there is going to be production of hydrogen, and we already framed the problem for you, right? You can either just make it and then flare it, or otherwise known as mining Bitcoin in some desert somewhere, or you could make it and just throw it into a pipeline and get it to a hub. Well, the only one we should come back to blending in some way. We should touch on blend. I don't know whether you, Jeff, whether you wanted me to talk about blending right now, or should we come back to it?
Well, we could definitely talk about blending. We could talk about so much that we don't have time to talk about. But I do know that the EPRI study found that basically the place where all that 45V induced clean hydrogen ended up was in the gas pipelines and in the power plants, which I guess makes sense because you don't have to build billions of dollars of demand.
It makes sense from a market economics perspective. It doesn't make sense from a climate perspective. This is exactly the misalignment that Michael was talking about earlier, and that our research is identifying as well.
Does it make sense up to a point in order incentivize the build out of the hub infrastructure that might be necessary to get to those break points for the industries that need
I
it?
don't think
once they
so,
want to
because there's
buy it?
nothing about that that encourages you to link the hydrogen supply up with the places in the country where you have those
Okay.
large
Right.
industrial consumers. So that's what the hubs program could have done, right? I mean, that should have been
Right.
one of the major priorities, and or future demand side incentives, which we don't currently have.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
If I have my Christmas list, I have 2 policy asks, right? One would be a moratorium on investing in distribution pipelines for hydrogen to homes.
Yep.
Right? Hydrogen makes no sense for home heating,
It's a dead
but
end.
the owners of those pipelines, those distribution pipelines, it's gone crazy in the UK with lobbying and pressure to get a pathway towards hydrogen. They know it's not going to happen, but as long as there's a pathway, they can then keep investing and adding investment to their regulated asset base. And they want to do that as long as possible because that's how they make their money. The second ask would be no blending. No blending. None. Zero. The problem you got, I said that the hydrogen costs you right now $4 or $5 per kilo to make. Right? As soon as you blend it, it is worth only its heat value. That's 35 cents per kilo. So blending, that's like saying, oh, I'm going to transport champagne from where it is produced in Epernay in France, near Reims. I'm going to transport it to the supermarket by blending it into the drinking water.
Or the Miller High Life, the champagne and
enormous,
beers.
huge destruction. Or exactly, you can use whichever beverage you prefer. I'm on water today, but it's got no champagne in it. It makes no sense. You are essentially taking an expensive, valuable resource and then carding it, mingling it to become essentially, low value.
Yep.
Does it generate supply? Well, you've already generated your supply through the Inflation Reduction Act. So no, you don't need further demand in order to crystallize. There is already 100 million tons of demand in the world for fertilizer and refineries. That is your demand. That is what you should be using to drive the
early market.
The early uptake from hydrogen that's easiest is going to come from that. Blending.
We are
and the other thing
seeing
about blending is also very expensive, right? They don't want to tell you about this. They'll say, oh, well, you can reuse a pipeline. No, you can't. Well, you can, but you have to downgrade the pipeline. First of all, hydrogen is less dense. And so it carries, you can increase the pressure to carry the same amount of energy, but you can't because it embrittles the pipeline. In fact, you have to drop the pressure. So you're not going to reuse pipelines. You're going to build new ones. And the problem with blending is somewhere you're injecting hydrogen, right, into gas. So near to that injection point, the mix is quite a bit of hydrogen, maybe 20%, let's say. Yeah. As it works its way through the system and gets to the users, well, you've got other people injecting gas and all sorts of stuff happening, and maybe you've only got 5% at the users, right? Mm-hmm. But you're metering, what you're charging on is volume, right? You're charging on volume, and there's all this effort made to keep the same calorific value. That's how it all works. So now you've got to say, well, hang on a second. Did I supply you 20% hydrogen or 5% hydrogen, or did it vary last night and change and so on? You've got so you've got to monitor your pipes for fractures and brittleness, and you've got to figure out how to remake your entire metering operation. It is literally, blending is perhaps the dumbest policy idea that in 20 years doing this, I haven't come across one dumber, honestly. Now, in Europe, you asked me about Europe. What they've just got this new thing that they've just pushed through called projects of common interest. This is the EU. And the projects of common interest, they're projects that go across borders. So they are multi-country projects. Mm-hmm. And what they've done is they said, oh, we only need hydrogen with hydrogen. And they charge the gas companies, right? There's a ENTSO G. ENTSO is the gas network operators for gas, or ENTSO G gas. And they said, well, where should we build gas? Where should we build hydrogen pipelines? And it's just amazing, the coincidence, because they said everywhere that there's a gas pipeline. And so they now have this spider's web of projects that have been anointed as projects of common interest, which means that it doesn't mean they've been funded, but they're more likely to be funded. And they literally go, a large proportion of them go from places where no hydrogen will be produced to places where no hydrogen will be consumed at a cost of, if they're built, hundreds of billions of euros. So that's what we're doing.
Okay.
Yeah. So what, can maybe just briefly, like what should be happening
Thank
is
you.
that we should be finding places where there's existing natural gas consumption to produce hydrogen, primarily in fertilizer production, because we know that's a demand that will continue long into the future.
Mhm.
Some amount in petrochemicals, although that's a demand that will largely decline overall as we consume less petroleum products. But it's going to decline over time, and we're going to still need plastic, so there's going to be demands there. Where you have access nearby to really good quality, low carbon resources, right? That's where we should be growing. That's the Tesla Roadster projects, right? To get the industry started and drive down the cost to the, Tesla Model S level, and then eventually to the, the Model 3 kind of price point.
Okay.
And in addition to that, we could have used the $8 billion or other demand side incentives to say, you know what, we probably should have at least one large scale DRI, direct reduction of iron with hydrogen project, which is a pathway to decarbonize steel in the US. And let's find the best location for that. Again, proximate to, hydrogen supply, or we'll build a pipeline to get it there. And we'll do that demo to make sure that we're moving that industry forward as well. And if we were doing those things, I'd be pretty happy with the direction we're going. There's still a potential for that because there is demand for clean steel. Largely that's coming from automakers who want to market clean vehicles to consumers, and they want to, have a differentiating factor that they make their Volvo or their BMW with clean steel, and they can afford to pay a premium because steel is only a fraction of the cost, maybe a few $100s of a finished vehicle. So, you double the cost of that, it's still a few $100s more for a car.
Right.
And you are seeing people realize that it's a lot easier to make ammonia where the hydrogen production can be cheapest and ship that ammonia than to try to ship hydrogen to the end consumer. And so we're going to start to see a kind of shifting geography of fertilizer and ammonia production, I think, to places where you have low cost, abundant renewables to make hydrogen and make ammonia from that.
Right. I was going to ask about the flipping in the green hydrogen to the existing kind of SMR Haber Bosch process, though, because I think most of these fertilizer plants are integrated. And I don't know if you guys are seeing anywhere where a fertilizer maker is saying, yeah, we'll flip that and we'll start taking the green hydrogen and Haber Bosch it. And at what price point that becomes viable?
There are capital expenditures that you need to reconfigure your balance of plant to do that. So it is not as trivial as just swapping it in molecule for molecule.
Right.
Yeah,
But there are a number of green fertilizer, green ammonia projects that are part of the, they're on the drawing board, that some of which have made FID, I think, to be the kind of early movers in the space.
Okay.
Let me come in on this because I should also declare that on this one I have I'm a very tiny investor in a business called Atlas Agro, which is part of the Pacific Northwest hub. Because the other one, Jesse, that you didn't mention is not only do you want to make your green fertilizer where the electricity, the green or pink nuclear electricity is cheap, but also where natural gas is more expensive.
Right. That's true too. Because otherwise you just use natural gas.
That's what defines your fertilizer prices. You kind of you want lots of farmers demanding fertilizer with a high natural gas price and very low clean electricity prices. And that's what, that I'm, like I say, I'm sort of talking my book because I'm an investor in Atlas Agro. But, what they're also doing, what I also want to say is that just putting hydrogen into an existing Haber-Bosch plant is actually pretty problematic because you've got this kind of thermal management. They are optimized around having this, SMR process. And so the flows of heat into and out of processes, they're all, that was all kind of figured out. I don't even want to say 40 years ago. I want to say, by Haber and Bosch originally, and optimized progressively since. Now suddenly you're bringing in a sense kind of cold hydrogen from somewhere else, and that's going to be very different. And in fact, you optimize the plant quite differently. Or in fact, what you do is you bring in electricity, you electrolyze there, so you can use some of the waste heat from processes, whether it's on the nitrate side or whether it's the Haber-Bosch side. So, I mean, it's going to be tough for some of these existing Haber-Bosch plants to be repurposed.
Right.
Some of them are just going to ultimately be stranded assets.
Yeah.
Even though you'd think it should be easy, they should be great markets for this green hydrogen.
There are also good candidates to do carbon capture, to do blue hydrogen production, or basically capture the CO2 from that SMR process. So some locations
That'd be
will do
easier.
that
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
Certainly. We have so many questions, gentlemen. Some of them have to do with curtailed renewables and whether or not that's a viable strategy. And Jesse, I'd be happy to take your perspective on that 5% rule and 45V versus. And then other folks are saying, how come hydrogen is the only one who has to follow these three pillars? Shouldn't everyone else? And I know you have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So I guess maybe quickly on the curtailment. I mean, our recommendations are that if you can demonstrate you're consuming electricity in a location where power is, clean power is being curtailed, and you can do that by pointing to a very low marginal electricity price in the region that you're consuming or the location you're consuming, then that should qualify as incremental clean supply, because otherwise, in the short term, it would have been curtailed. The problem is the economics. That can be supplemental, but not primary to your business model, because at least today, electrolyzers are still quite capital intensive. And in order to make hydrogen at a reasonable price, you have to use them at a fairly high utilization rate, probably at least 60%, ideally more like 70 or 80%. And there's nowhere that you're curtailing power on the margin 70% of the hours of the year. And if there is, not for long, right? I mean, people are going to do something else there that sucks up that power too. So it's supplemental, but until electrolyzers get really cheap, like 80% reduction in cost, you're not going to be able to afford to operate them, only 20 or 30% of the hours of the year. So that might be a strategy for the 2040s when we have a very decarbonized grid with lots of renewables. And you've got very cheap, hydrogen electrolyzers to sort of operate them as a truly flexible demand that only turns on when you have an excess of renewables. But even then, what that will probably mean is we just build more dedicated renewables to supply those electrolyzers. And we have a paper on this too that we're in review right now on the role of demand sinks, or the sort of ability to just suck up electricity and turn it into something good. And hydrogen is one of those. But you have to have a low enough capex and not too high a value so that you're not willing to consume when prices are high, like Bitcoin miners would today. And if you can kind of get those two things together and it's highly automated process, then maybe it would play that role. So electrolyzers maybe in the long term.
Okay.
On the why not of other things, I mean, there's two answers to that. One is that Congress explicitly said for hydrogen, if you want $3, it's got to be nearly clean, 0.45 kilograms or less. They didn't say that for the other subsidies. So that's, the legal reason. The substantive justification for that is what I started at the very beginning, pointing out that if you plug an electrolyzer into the grid today, it's actually twice as polluting as simply using hydrogen from natural gas. Mm-hmm. Versus what Michael explained about a heat pump or an EV, where they're many times more efficient than the fossil processes that they replace. And therefore, plugging into today's grid with an EV already is reducing emissions and air pollution across the board, pretty much everywhere, unless you're purely fueled by coal. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's remarkable that an EV drivetrain is so much more efficient than an internal combustion engine that you could exclusively charge an EV on a diesel generator and still reduce emissions relative to a gasoline car. So, and there's a similar story around natural gas combustion versus for heating versus heat pumps. So, if the process itself is already cleaner than the alternative and it's getting cleaner as our grid gets cleaner, we don't necessarily have to put these strict restrictions in place. But for hydrogen, if we just said, go ahead and produce hydrogen wherever you want, whenever you want, we'd actually be adding hundreds of millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions beyond simply using fossil gas to produce hydrogen. And that's, be a big step in the wrong direction.
Well, I know that we have so much more to talk about than we have time to talk about it. And I think we're running a little bit late. I do want to ask you guys, though, one question verbatim from one of our commenters, which I think might suit us for a closer. The question is, it sounds as if both Jesse and Michael believe that public policy on hydrogen is a complete boondoggle. Is that a valid interpretation of this conversation? And if it is, what is the non-boondoggle version of public policy on hydrogen? Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'm going to go first. That way, Jess, you'll get the last word. It's not a complete boondoggle. It is an almost complete boondoggle. And you look at all these projects, right? There's the IEA has tracked, I think, 370 hydrogen projects around the world. BloombergNEF, the team that I created, the business I helped with, they've got their own database, and it's even more extensive. And something like, I think it's 7 to 10% of the projects have reached final investment decision by number, but it's only 1 or 2% by volume. And if you look at it in terms of electrolyzer capacity, the electrolyzer manufacturers of the world, they had 36 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity. In 2023, they're going to be increasing it to 56 or some huge number of gigawatts of capacity. They only sold 2 gigawatts last year, right? And so what you're seeing is this huge kind of efflorescence of, you call it hype, I don't know what you want to call it. You can, interest, projects being developed and so on. But actually what's happening is a few percent of them are going to happen. If you look in the time frame through till 2030, they'll be lucky if 10% of everything we see happens. And you know what? That's probably about the right amount. We don't want to do nothing and just say, hey, it's much better to do heat pumps and electric vehicles. And, as long as we're shut down coal and that's it, do nothing. That's not the right answer, because we need to build supply chains, knowledge, and so on. And, but, let's call it 10% of what you see out there. If that happens, that's probably the right amount. The other thing is, let the hydrogen ladder be the guide. Do the stuff that we really can't do some other way, or keep it to the stuff that has the biggest impact on climate. And, within all the kind of policy that we see is the kernel of policy that actually does that. Largely, by the way, because capital will be rationed by the markets. There'll be hundreds of billions spent by policy, through policy, but you know what? Divide that by 10 years. It's $10-15 billion a year. It's not that much. The real tens and the hundreds of billions per year can only be applied by the capital markets. And guess what? They're going to focus on the stuff that actually works. So, it's like the policy is, maybe I've even been unfair calling it an almost complete boondoggle. It's an almost complete distraction, frankly, except with the single exception of IRA, which is throwing, tens, maybe even hundreds of billions for some limited period, a lot of which will, I'm afraid, be wasted. And otherwise, most of it will just disappear between now and 2030. Most of it will evaporate.
Yeah, I would probably, again, similar view as Michael on this. I think I wouldn't call it a complete boondoggle. I would say if the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, the 45E subsidy, is implemented in a way that ensures that this big, subsidy for hydrogen is only going to actually scale up clean hydrogen production methods. We didn't talk about challenges around biogas and landfill gas and things like that, which is a whole nother issue that needs to be addressed effectively. Otherwise, it could be a big loophole. We got to make sure that the 3 pillars rules are implemented soundly so that only clean electricity is used to produce hydrogen. But if it does, what we're going to do is accomplish that technology policy goal, if nothing else, right? We're going to drive a whole bunch of electrolyzers into the market. We're going to scale production up to gigawatt scale, up from the sort of bespoke, 30 megawatt a year manufacturing plants they have today. We're going to get a lot of experience building and operating these projects. And that will drive down the cost for electrolyzers and hydrogen production in a similar manner as Germany and Japan and other countries, Spain, really helped in a very expensive public way, drive down the cost of solar for the rest of the world in a way that has been truly game changing. So this is the right time to be scaling up the hydrogen industry, and it's the right, we should be doing it in as clean a way as possible. There are, 2 big concerns I have. One is, if you're going to do that, like we learned from solar, with a production subsidy, that subsidy should be falling as the cost of the thing you're subsidizing falls. And there isn't a feedback mechanism in the IRA subsidy for that. Congress could address that in the future. It'll introduce some policy uncertainty. As the costs start to mount, I think it's probably pretty inevitable that we'll have to come to account on that front, which is why, again, I tried to warn, Senate staff to get ahead of this at the beginning, and wasn't able to get that done. And then there's the demand side piece, which I don't think is too late to get right. We could add rationalizing demand side policies that say, you know what, like Michael said, we're not going to allow, state regulators could say, you know what, we're not going to allow blending into natural gas pipelines. The DOE, could use some of the flexible funding for industrial decarbonization they have. They have another $6 billion grant program for industrial decarbonization to say, you know what, we're going to go build a DRI steel plant, or, some of these other first users. And we could still use some of that hub funding in an effective way. Again, Congress could come back and revisit this in a few years and enact a broader industrial decarbonization strategy, which I think we desperately need, that would help align these incentives too. So again, there will be waste. There will be some projects that probably are going in the wrong place. That's true for much public policy, but it will also have a significant positive impact by driving down the cost of hydrogen and helping scale up these industries. So let's start to steer it in a more effective way. I shouldn't say we don't want to do this at all. I think it's the right time to be doing it, but we need to be continually refining the trajectory from here to make sure it has the biggest impact.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been really informative for me, and I hope our audience has enjoyed it too. Sorry, y'all couldn't answer all the questions y'all have, but
there's a lot of great questions there.
Yeah, no doubt. And we're gonna keep working on this here at Canary Media. Michael Liebreich, Jesse Jenkins, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you all for attending. Please sign up for Canary Media's newsletter. You'll see the information on how to do that popping up here. Please let us know, reach out to us to tell us how we can support your work and your questions with our reporting. And please do help us keep doing our work with your generous financial contributions as much as possible. This has been a great time. Really appreciate your contributions, gentlemen, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for all the great reporting you all are doing at Canary.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And likewise, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.